2000 when Marie and I were being introduced to the Yachats community and thought we would look at a house when they took us to see the day house up on King Street. We had to go through the next door neighbor to be screened before we could see the house. And so when she approved us, she brought me 2 books. And one was on the history of Yachats, a big thick one. And the other one was a smaller book that was researched and written by Joanne Kittel on the history of Native Americans in Yachats. And as soon as I got my hands on that, I said, I've got to know who this person is. So Joanne, it's a real joy to have you come and share with us this morning.
Recently, I revised that article, more like an article, it's right up here. And so the time doesn't allow me to really go into details about the research that myself and Suzanne Curtis has done and the subsequent research I've done. But I first want to announce something very important before I get started. And how many of you attend the Yachats Music Festival? It's going to be having its 31st year, and the Presbyterian Church is one of the sponsors of it, and has been for the entire 31 years. For the first time in 31 years, they've invited a local to play, and they've invited Milo Brahmins here to play at Sunday. I think Yachats Music Festival and Four Seasons Arts are very lucky to have Milo. Second thing is, how many of you here attended this breakfast in 1996? Maybe. I spoke here in 1996, and right after I started distributing this article. So, and I don't feel like a newbie anymore. So really, given the time I have, I'd like to really talk about what's happened in the last ensuing years. For those of you who don't know, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academician, I'm not a researcher, and I'm not of Indian ancestry. I'm a psychiatric social worker. And my husband and I bought our 27 acres next door to Cape Perpetua about 25 years ago now. And we moved here in 1993. And part of our stewardship of that property was to do 3 projects. One was, any place I ever lived, I always researched who were the prior owners of my property, who homesteaded my property, and who were the Aboriginal people that called this area their home. And I was going to do that here. The second thing was for my husband and I to work it out with governmental bodies to put the Oregon Coast Trail through our property. And the third project was to do a conservation easement on our property. How many of you know what a conservation easement is? Well, what it is, for those who don't know, it's a landowner will voluntarily put restrictions forever on their property. And that's illegal. A fiduciary role that they play, and the sole purpose of creating conservation easements for environmental purposes, to preserve green space, preserve wildlife, preserve riparian and stream areas, and to preserve cultural artifacts. And that has been a journey. But I never dreamed, even back when I was speaking here in 1996, that those 3 projects would be like throwing a pebble in a pond, and those pebbles having such a ripple effect on the Yachats community that led to education, understanding, and a much deeper appreciation of Aboriginal history here. And the other thing I never imagined was how many individuals, organizations, agencies, and governmental bodies end up being involved with these 3 projects in particular. And I just have to mention it because it's just, when I started making the list, it overwhelmed me. We had the support of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, particularly Robert Kenta, their cultural director then and cultural director now, as well as tribal council member. The Confederated Tribes of the Kuzla or Umpqua, how you saw Indians came into play, and that include Don Whereat, Teddy Whereat Phillips, David Petrie, and the Cultural Committee. And of course, Oregon State Parks got involved. The Inside Usaw National Forest got involved, particularly Phyllis Steeves, who for many years was their archaeologist and tribal liaison, and she just recently retired. The City of Yachats got involved, particularly their Parks and Commons Commission and Trails Committee. The Lincoln Land Legacy Program, that is basically under the county commissioners got involved, and that was administered by Wayne Belmont. Of course, the Lincoln County Historical Society, the Little Log Church and Museum, the Oregon Historical Society, where I spent a lot of time in Portland. Dr. John Erlandson, a world-renowned archaeologist and professor and chair at the U of O. Joanne Berger, our state senator. Gene Cowan, our state rep. Nonprofits like View the Future, Central Coast Land Conservancy, Defenders of Wildlife, National Coast Trails Association, the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council, National Resources Crew, the Northwest Youth Corps, the Oregon Youth Conservation Corps, and the Age of Job Corps. And the State Historical Preservation Office, and we can't forget ODOT. And then many, many individuals who, upon learning about what happened to the Aboriginal people here and their history, came in large numbers to build a coast trail through our property called the Amalga Trail, and to maintain it for these many years. And you know, when Norm and I first bought our property, we would commute from Minnesota. And the first real trip that we had here after we bought the property in 1987, I found the Lincoln County Historical Society sign at the cemetery that talked about the LC subagency. The same day, I happened to explore the Yachats Library, and I came upon a book called The Indians of Western Oregon by Stephen Dowd Beckham. And I turned to the chapter called The Reservation Years. And in that chapter, he talked about something called the LC subagency, which was a part of the reservation complex that, and the LC subagency existed from 1859 to 1875 in Yachats. What Stephen Dowd Beckham wrote, and what was at the sign next to Yachats Cemetery was radically different. And that was my first clue, red flag, that something was wrong with how people were interpreting history. In that same chapter, and that same trip, I learned that there was a proposed trail down the north side of Cape Perpetua that was never built because there was no place for it to go to. And that proposed trail was called the Amalga Trail. In Stephen Dowd Beckham's chapter on reservation, he tells the Amalga story. And then it came to me, I wonder if the name in the story is the same why the trail was named. It took about 2 years for me to confirm that, yes, the story about Amalga and the naming of the trail were the same. I never, for many years, 20 plus years, I never could find out who named Amalga. But speaking of those pebbles and concentric circles, about 4 years ago, I found out who named the Amalga Trail, who learned the story back in 1972 and was so moved by the story, decided he was working for Federal Forest Service. He was in charge of the Cape Perpetua Scenic Area. He created the Gwen Trail, the Gwen Creek Trail. He created Cummins Creek Trail. And he wanted to build a trail down the north face of Cape Perpetua called Amalga. And you all know him too. His name's Lloyd Collette. And so we've become good friends. And that was, I found that out because a friend and I were working on getting the giant spruce tree at Cape Perpetua to become an Oregon heritage tree. And so we were interviewing all the oldies and retirees who used to work at Cape Perpetua that were still alive. So in the course of interviewing Lloyd and Vera at their home LC River, I found out he's the one that named the Amalga Trail. So that was really thrilling. It's an interesting course that when you give a trail easement away, that it still takes 24 years to get that trail finished. And we don't have time to go into the interesting barriers that occurred, but actually, after 10 years, the trail did get built down the north side of Cape Perpetua and a half mile through our property. And we had a wonderful dedication in '98. 120 people came, the largest trail attendance in trail park history at the time. But it took another 12 years to get this trail from the northwest end of our property to town. And some wonderful, the ODOT couldn't figure it out, state parks couldn't figure it out how to keep it on ODOT easement. But Jerry and Kathleen Sand, who had just moved to town, he's a landscape architect, and they're now owners of the Vernon Botanical Preserve, he figured it out. And the city wrote a grant, and we got the grant to build it, and it, so it was completed in 2009 with a lot of volunteers, and it was the first grant that application the city ever wrote for a project that was basically outside of town. That's how important this became. And then I started working on learning about indigenous history right after I moved here in 1993. I thought it would be a simple thing. I've always been able to find out by going to local historical societies or tribal cultural offices. It was easy, but not here. I found a lot of information from Walport North about Aboriginal history, a lot of information about Aboriginal history from 10 Mile Creek South, but nothing in our area. In fact, what I was being told by Hazel Miller at the Little Log Church, in Marjorie Hayes' book, which has been an interesting journey learning about her and her book through her husband Chester. And from the Lincoln County Historical Society that there were no permanent settlements in Yachats, that Indians would come from different regions in the summer, collect shellfish, that's why you had all those large shellfish piles here, but then leave. I just had a hard time believing that. I mean, look, we live in Yachats and love it. So, I mean, you know, just use the logic. So that's when I started going elsewhere, like the Oregon Historical Society, which is where Marjorie Hayes had gone. In fact, the woman who helped me used to help Marjorie. And I met Robert Kenta and Don Werat, and they allowed my friend and I, Suzanne, to go into their archives. And eventually we met Phyllis Steeves, who allowed us to look at archaeological site investigations in this area. And then Suzanne and I realized that the information we recovered was not really written down for this community and this area to be able to read and learn about. So what became a personal journey became a little more socially responsible, because we felt like we just couldn't be the keepers of this information on our own, which led to the writing of the article. The tribes agreed to supervise us. In fact, that was the only way we could write it. Everything had to be doubly verifiable, and every sentence approved by them, because they didn't want any misinformation being distributed. As Robert said, it's better to have no information than misinformation. And certainly it became clear why the sign at the cemetery was so different than Beckham's version. So then we had even though there is information out about the sub-agency, it certainly wasn't getting to Yachats and to know what happened to the people here in Yachats. But in fact, what we uncovered was that, of course, there were people, permanent residences in Yachats for thousands and thousands of years. And that the people were hunters and gatherers. The last people to live here were southern villages of the LC, who called themselves the Utsitzlums. And the last village site that's actually known was a village site called Yahike. And that's in the Okona dialogue and language. When the Kuzunor Umpqua people were imprisoned here, they had a different language and different dialects, and they called it Yachats. You can see how the name got involved, or evolved. The best that we know about what Yachat means is not dark waters at the foot of the mountain, not dark waters of timbered hills. It's as far as you can go along the beach. And there was a large village site that's now been destroyed, where the 804 starts, where Stark Creek is now. So it's probably that was the village site called Yachats. And in the LC version, that was called Silver Salmon Creek. Cape Perpetua was called Helhike, and the Coos version was Helakitch. The people here, as the hunters and gatherers, had two residences. They had their summer residences and they had their winter residences. And archaeological site investigations show that they had a very wide diet. I mean, of course, they had salmon and other fish, but they had shellfish, but they also had ate mammals and birds, and ate a lot of berries and bulbous roots, like camas was a staple. They were very accomplished at smoking and preserving their food. Here, archaeological site investigations show right in town that go back 1,500 years. By Cape Perpetua and around Cape Perpetua and our property, it goes back 5,000 years. Probably not older sites have not been found because the ocean 5,000 years ago was about 3.5 miles out to sea, where it is now. So most of those archaeological sites are probably underwater. They traded with other villages and bands, and this was a center point of trade, and what's well known is that the beach where the Shamrock Lodge is was where they used to play a game called the shinny game. In the Coho jargon language, which was their trading language, was called Coho, hence why the new development is called Coho. And the shinny game was where they would use basically a ball and sticks, sort of like field hockey. And that was a common game that they played when they traded. What happened to the people of Yachats? Well, what happened to them is that about 30 years before the reservation was created here, most of the Indians in Oregon were being wiped out by smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles. And in fact, about 80% to 90% of the Indians in the Northwest were gone by the time homesteading started, and the whites started coming, and the gold rush. So that by the time whites came and were confiscating land, what was left of our bands and tribes were a shell of what they used to be. And they were very vulnerable and easy to manipulate and persuade to be on the reservations. They were promised goods, services, supplies to start a new life on a 1.5 million acre reservation, with the headquarters being at Siletz and Grand Ronde. The Coast Treaty was never ratified, so when they were boated and forcibly marched up, there was nothing for them here. At Siletz and Grand Ronde, and eventually at Yachats, about 50% died on the marches, and about 60-70% died in the first 20 years of the reservations. And then the reservations kept homesteading, so the reservation got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. They thought no one would ever want to homestead in the Yachats area. So they forcibly marched the Coos and Lower Umpqua between 1860 and 1862 up to this area. They made the Siuslaw Indians and Elsie Indians part of this lower reservation called a sub-agency. The Elsie, by that time, were just a shell of what they used to be. And in a few years, they closed down the reservation north of the LC River for homesteading and forced what LC were left to the south end. The Siuslaw fared the best because they could stay on the Siuslaw River. So here you have these people who are not allowed to do their hunting and gathering practices because then they would have to have knives or tools or whatever, and the agent saw that as weapons. And they try to make these people agriculturalists by having them grow corn and wheat and soybeans out here where the church is, all the way down to the Yachats Commons. Of course, where there was crop fails, and most of these people starved, died of exposure, were beaten to death, particularly if they tried to escape. And they went through a series of agents, all pretty cruel, until in 12 years, a new agent came, and his name was Sam Case. Sound familiar? He created Newport, Sam Case Elementary School, and he was very astute, and he was far more compassionate, and he is the one that said, go back to your hunting and gathering practices, and have them build a road up the Yachats River where they, 6 miles up, and they were able to grow crops, they were able to do trading, they were able to build their own good homes, and they started having a great life. Then Sam Case moved up to Newport, and the next person was a gentleman by the name of George Litchfield. Sound familiar for some of you. And George's son Charles lived to be 97 and only died in the mid-90s in Toledo. And Charles was an attorney in Newport for a lot of years, like 60 years. George, too, was a big advocate of the Indians and trying to preserve and reestablish their culture here, allowing them to go back to their religious, spiritual, cultural practices, and really thriving. And when Siletz and Rand Brown worked. So when the Surveyor General at the time found out that they were successfully growing crops up the Yachats River, and there was a road up that they created, he wanted to close down the LC sub-agency and open it up for homesteading. A law had passed, a federal law, that said if the chief and heads of a reservation refuses to move, we have to leave them there. So there was a meeting down here in Yachats, and quotes from that meeting are in the article, and all 17 headsmen and chiefs said, no, we've struggled hard, we lost our first home, we're not going to lose our second home. The Siletz agent, who was the boss of George Litchfield, lied to the Surveyor General saying, yes, they all agree to go. And the Army came, rallied a lot of them up and forced them to go up to Siletz. Others ran away, and many of the Coos and Lower Umpqua became refugees in their own homeland. Whereas the LC practiced above-ground internment, and Marjorie Hay talks about that in her book, the Coos and Lower Umpqua practiced below-ground internment, and they lost a lot of people. You know, in the first 12 years, 60 to 70% died. And they were buried from where the Spouting Whale is to Leroy's Blue Whale Restaurant. And in the early 30s, when the highway was built through, they took, a lot of those graves got uncovered, and skeletons and artifacts were stolen. But the vast majority of those graves are now under Highway 101 as filled. So it was always very hard for the Coos and Lower Umpqua people to this day to drive through Yachats knowing that their ancestors' graves were desecrated and their bones are under Highway 101. So when we finished the Amalga Trail, they came. 25 tribal members came. Matthew and Marie were there. I don't know if anyone else came to the dedication. And Milo was the videographer there. And it was quite an emotional event. Over 150 people came. And many of the people had read this article and knew what happened at the LC sub-agency. And so not only were the tribal members really impressed with the numbers that came out, but also impressed that so many people, including Max and Marie, told the tribal members how sorry they were about what happened to their ancestors. It was a very healing time. And I'd like you, I know we're running over time, but I'd like to read to you the Amanda story. What?
Go right ahead.
I'll go right ahead, okay. And it's a documented story. It's not a myth. One of the Army soldiers who was responsible for gathering up Indians that ran away or Indians that were still hiding down in Coos Bay area and the Umpqua River area had a diary. And that diary was found by Stephen Dow Beckham. And his name was Royal Benzel. He said that it's in the story of Amanda that we know through his diary, she was a Coos woman and a common law wife of a white man. They had a daughter, I believe 8 years old, by the name of Julia. After the establishment of these reservations, soldiers had the right to remove Native people to reservations, even if they had children, unless they were legally married to a white person. This particular white man refused to marry Amanda. So in 1864, Amanda was given was separated and forcibly taken away from her daughter and forcibly marched up here. And Amanda was blind. And this is a quote. The Coos woman Amanda had a terrible time climbing around Cape Perpetua on the forced march in 1864. Amanda, who is blind, tore her feet horribly over these ragged rocks, leaving blood sufficient to track her by. I cursed the Indian agents in generally, and Harvey in particular, who was the agent at the time in Yachats. We don't know what happened to Amanda. Most likely she died here. And you can read details about the story, more quotes from the diary of that particular forced march. We have the entire Amanda story near the Amanda Bridge, encased in a waterproof box for hikers to read. So combining this history with getting the Amanda Trail completed and later doing a conservation easement to protect the archaeological sites on our property as well as our wildlife. In fact, we have the most restrictive conservation easement in the state of Oregon. It preserves those 27 acres, and we're the first conservation easement to have archaeological site protection in the state of Oregon, because we found sites that are over 1,800 years old on our property, and a possible Vision Quest site. So that'll be protected forever, and we've established, because of what this community has done and the outreach, and we changed the Lincoln County Historical Society sign, now reflects what really happened at the agency. The owner of Coves are going to be putting up signs that talk about Aboriginal history here in Yachats, that the tribes feel much more comfortable coming back and feel a lot more welcomed. In fact, last year, it was another first for the Yachats Music Festival. They invited, for the first time, someone that was not one of their artists to do a seminar, and that was Doc Slider, who was the flutist for the Coos-Lora-Umpqua-Sayusaw tribe, did a seminar at the Yachats Music Festival. So there's been lots of changes, and I applaud this community for learning about the Aboriginal history and having a greater appreciation for it, and helping the two local tribes heal from multi-generational trauma by acknowledging this history. Thanks. Any questions or? Yes.
Is it rational for the Army to do that to Native? Was when you just put in roads in it?
Can you
Why did the Army do that?
put in the road?
No. Was that the rationale for being, he's asking the rationale for the cruelty?
For the rationale for the cruelty?
Yeah, I was curious why they...
Oh, the rationale for the cruelty was to exterminate the Indians.
But this was back when we were settling, so there's a lot of, like Oregon Trail people coming through and they were getting attacked by Indians, right? Was that the same time frame?
Well, there's a lot of myths about being attacked by Indians. It was really a mutual under where the Indians' lands were being taken away and the Indians were being attacked. Like the Rogue River War is a good example of that. the Indians would not get off the land, and then the army came and attacked the Indians. So that's part of what it's all about. So it's you know, some of the myths is that people innocently came, and there was a sense of manifest destiny that people thought they had a right to take, you know, the Indians' property. And so it led to some pretty grave wars. And the result of it is that usually the people who did not want war, the Indian people who just said, okay, let's just have peace, let's just preserve our culture, okay, we'll go on reservations, those are the ones that were exterminated. Any other questions? Yeah, John.
Joanne, who were the two tribes again that benefited from this healing that took place?
It was the Confederated Tribes of the Kuzla, Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. And their Aboriginal territory is from 10 Mile Creek to south of Coos Bay.
Okay.
And the second is the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, who's from 10 Mile Creek north to Niatsu, that area, and east. And again, when they say confederated, that means it's a number of different bands and tribes that are together. So at the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, there's 14 different bands. Because, you know, when they did the Coast Reservation, they gathered Indians from southern Washington to northern California. And most of those bands or tribes are extinct. There's no traceable blood. Like with the LC, there's no traceable blood. The last known LC to die was in the 1950s.
Joanne, would you repeat the definition of Yachats again?
The only definition that we found with our research is as far as you can go along the beach.
As far as you can go along the beach.
And you know, when you look at most tribal village or band names, that those people would name their village after a location. So, the LC River in their language was Ushi. And so the LC as a band called themselves the Sitzlans, or the people of Ushi. Thank you.
Joanne, your dedication, your inquisitiveness is something that has brought healing, and being a part of that was very special to me and to Marie. But the historic significance is really important, and we really appreciate
Yeah, if anybody wants to see the article or read the article, you can get it online at www.yahat.info, so it's free. Or if you want a hard copy, you can buy it at cost at Mari's Books. And that was our promise to the tribes, that we would sell it at cost. And speaking of the circle growing, when we get it printed up at Laser Quick in Newport, and when they found out we were selling it at cost, they only charged us a nickel above their cost, because they wanted to make a contribution too. That was really cool.